Some nights, the dead are more restless than the living. My name is Marcus, and I've been working night security at Hillcrest Cemetery for 8 years now. It's not glamorous work, but it pays the bills and keeps me away from people during the day when I need to sleep. The cemetery spans 43 acres of rolling hills outside town, with sections dating back to 1857. Most nights, nothing happens. I make my rounds, check the gates, review the security cameras, and write my reports. The dead don't cause trouble, it's the living you have to watch out for. The job came naturally to me after my discharge from the Army. I needed something quiet, something that let me think without constant noise and conversation. Hillcrest offered that peace. During my shift, from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., the only sounds are wind through the oak trees, the occasional car passing on the county road, and the hum of the security equipment in my office. The groundskeepers had installed a new camera system 2 years ago, 16 high-definition monitors that cycle through feeds from around the property. Most of the time, they show empty walkways, headstones, and the occasional deer or stray cat. My routine is simple. I arrive at 9:45, get briefed by the day guard, and settle into the small office near the main entrance. First round of camera checks at 11, then a walking patrol at midnight. I review footage from the previous day while drinking coffee, checking for anything unusual: vandalism, trespassing, damage from weather. Second walking patrol at 3 a.m., then more camera work until the morning shift arrives. 8 years of the same schedule, and I'd grown comfortable with the predictability. The office sits in a converted maintenance building with cinder block walls and fluorescent lighting. One wall holds the bank of security monitors. Another has filing cabinets full of burial records and incident reports. There's a small refrigerator, a coffee maker, and a desk where I complete my paperwork. Through the single window, I can see the main entrance and the oldest section of the cemetery, where weathered headstones lean at odd angles and the grass grows wild between the plots. That's where I first noticed her. It started 3 months ago, during a routine review of the previous night's footage. I was cycling through camera feeds from around 2 a.m. when I caught movement in Section A, the oldest part of the cemetery. The timestamp read 2:17 a.m. A figure was walking slowly between the headstones, moving with the careful steps of someone navigating unfamiliar ground in darkness. I rewound the footage and watched again. It was an elderly woman, maybe 70s or 80s, wearing a dark coat and carrying something in her hands. She moved directly to a specific grave plot 47B, according to my cemetery. Maypand knelt down beside the headstone. The camera angle wasn't perfect, but I could see her placing something on the ground and remaining there for several minutes. Then she stood, appeared to say something to the grave, and walked back the way she'd come. I made a note in my report but didn't think much of it. People grieve in different ways, and families sometimes visit at odd hours to avoid crowds or prying eyes. What struck me as unusual was the timing. 2:17 a.m. was oddly specific, and most people don't navigate a cemetery in complete darkness unless they know exactly where they're going. The next week, I made a point to review the same time period. There she was again. Same timestamp, same route. 2:17 a.m. exactly. She placed something on the same grave and stayed for the same amount of time. I started checking every night after that, and she appeared in the footage like clockwork. Always at 2:17, always carrying something, always visiting plot 47B. Curiosity got the better of me after a month of watching her. During my 3 a.m. patrol, I walked to Section A and found plot 47B. The headstone was old, weathered limestone that had been worn smooth by decades of weather. But I could still make out the inscription, "Unknown, rest in peace." No name, no dates, no family information, just unknown. Fresh flowers lay at the base of the headstone, white roses that looked like they'd been placed there hours earlier. The soil around the grave was disturbed, as if someone had been kneeling there recently. I knelt down myself and found something else pressed into the earth near the flowers. A simple gold wedding band, worn thin with age. Back in the office, I pulled the burial records for Section A. Plot 47B had been purchased in 1943 by the county for an unidentified woman found dead near the railroad tracks. No family had claimed the body. No one had come forward with information about her identity. The records indicated she was approximately 70 years old at the time of death, with no personal effects except for the clothes she was wearing. She had been buried in a simple pine casket, with a generic headstone marking her as unknown. I continued watching the footage every night. The woman never failed to appear at exactly 2:17 a.m. She always carried Flowers White Rosa sand. She always spent the same amount of time at the grave. I began to notice other details. She moved like someone familiar with the space, never hesitating about which path to take or where to step. Her behavior suggested she'd been making this journey for years, not months. But the more I watched, the more questions arose. I started reviewing older footage, going back through the archived security recordings. The woman appeared in every night's recording for as far back as the files went over 2 years of footage. Always the same time, always the same routine. How had no one else noticed this pattern? I decided to stay alert during my 3 a.m. patrol and try to encounter her directly. For 2 weeks, I positioned myself in Section A around 2:15, hiding behind larger headstones and monuments where I could observe without being seen. I never saw her during those nights, despite checking the footage afterward and confirming she'd been there at the usual time. The camera showed her clear as day, but she hadn't been visible to my naked eye. The realization made my skin crawl. Either the camera was somehow malfunctioning in the same specific way every night, or I was watching something that existed only on the recorded footage. I started examining the recordings more carefully, looking for signs of tampering or digital artifacts. But the woman appeared naturally in the scene, casting shadows and interacting with the environment in ways that seemed genuine. I brought the recordings to Ted, the day security guard who'd been working at Hillcrest for 15 years. He watched the footage with growing unease, pausing and rewinding to examine details. When I asked if he'd ever seen anything similar, he was quiet for a long moment. "There was something," he said finally, "about 5 years ago, before the new camera system. I'd find fresh flowers on that grave every few days, always white roses. Thought it was family, but the record showed nobody had claimed the body. I mentioned it to the groundskeepers, but they said they'd never seen anyone placing flowers there during the day." Ted pulled out an old incident report from his files. "This might interest you," he said, handing me a yellowed piece of paper. "From 1943, the year that woman was buried. The cemetery supervisor reported that someone had been leaving flowers on the unknown grave within days of the burial. Fresh flowers appeared several times a week for months, but nobody ever saw who was placing them." The report was signed by a supervisor named William Hendricks, and his handwriting was shaky with age. In the margin, he'd added a personal note. "Mrs. Margaret Hendricks passed away October 15th, 1943. Still visits the unknown grave nightly. I believe she knew the woman somehow." I stared at the report, understanding beginning to dawn. Margaret Hendricks, the supervisor's wife, had been visiting the unknown grave in 1943. The woman in my security footage appeared to be elderly, roughly the right age to be Margaret if she'd somehow continued visiting for 80 years. That night, I watched the footage with new intensity. At 2:17 a.m., the woman appeared as usual, walking her familiar path to plot 47B. But this time, I noticed something I'd missed before. As she knelt at the grave, she turned slightly toward the camera, and for just a moment, her face was clearly visible in the infrared feed. Her features were sharp and defined, with deep-set eyes and a determined expression. She looked exactly like the woman in a photograph I'd found in the cemetery's historical files, a picture of William and Margaret Hendricks, taken at a cemetery dedication ceremony in 1942. I printed the photograph and compared it to a still frame from the security footage. The resemblance was unmistakable. Margaret Hendricks, who had died in October of 1943, was still visiting the unknown grave every night at 2:17 a.m., 81 years after her own death. The next morning, I researched Margaret's burial location. She was interred in Section C, Plot 15A, less than 100 yards from the unknown grave. Her headstone bore a simple inscription: Margaret Hendricks, beloved wife, October 15th, 1943. The dates matched William's report exactly. I began to understand the pattern. Margaret had started visiting the unknown grave shortly after the woman's burial, continuing until her own death weeks later. But something had compelled her to keep making those visits, even after death. The timing to 17 a.m. might have been significant. Perhaps it was when she'd discovered the unknown woman's body by the railroad tracks, or when she'd learned of her death. During my next shift, I decided to visit Margaret's grave during my 3 a.m. patrol. The headstone was well maintained, with fresh flowers that looked professionally placed. But as I stood there, I felt an overwhelming sense of sadness, as if the grief was still present in the air around the grave. I stayed longer than usual, trying to understand what would drive someone to continue visiting a stranger's grave for over 80 years after death. The cemetery was silent except for wind through the trees, but I had the distinct feeling I was being watched. When I returned to the office, I found something that made my blood run cold. On my desk, placed carefully next to my coffee cup, was a single white rose. It was fresh, with dewdrops still clinging to the petals, and it smelled exactly like the roses I'd been finding on the unknown grave. I was alone in the cemetery. The gates were locked, the perimeter was secure, and I'd seen no one during my patrol. But somehow, a fresh white rose had appeared on my desk while I was visiting Margaret's grave. I looked at the security monitors, cycling through all the feeds. Everything appeared normal: empty walkways, silent headstones, no sign of movement anywhere on the property. But when I pulled up the footage from Plot 47B, the timestamp showed 2:17 a.m. had passed while I was outside. The woman had made her usual visit, placed her flowers, and left. The rose on my desk was identical to the one she'd been carrying. I've been working at Hillcrest for 8 years, and I thought I understood the boundary between the living and the dead. But Margaret Hendricks has been visiting that unknown grave for 81 years, and now she seems to know that I've been watching. The rose on my desk feels like an acknowledgement, or maybe an invitation. I still don't know who the unknown woman was, or why Margaret felt compelled to visit her grave every night for the rest of eternity. But I understand now that some connections transcend death, and some grief never ends. Every night at 2:17 a.m., Margaret keeps her vigil, and every morning I find the evidence of her devotion. The dead don't cause trouble, I used to say, but sometimes they remind us that love doesn't end with the grave. The dead have their own weight, and it never truly leaves you. My name is Elena Vasquez, and I've been driving for Hartwell Funeral Services for 11 years. It's not the kind of job most people think about until they need it, but someone has to transport the deceased with dignity and care. I drive the same routes every week from the funeral home to various cemeteries around the county, sometimes with a casket in the back, sometimes returning empty after a service. The work requires patience, respect, and a steady hand on long, quiet drives through rolling countryside. Hartwell's is a family operation that's been serving our community since 1928. The funeral home sits on Elm Street in a converted Victorian mansion, with the garage and vehicle bay added in the 1960s. We maintain 3 Hearsto newer models for standard services and 1 vintage 1987 Cadillac that families sometimes request for traditional ceremonies. I primarily drive the 2012 Lincoln, a reliable vehicle with low mileage and impeccable maintenance records. My route to Maplewood Cemetery takes me through 15 miles of county roads, past farmland and forest, over 2 bridges, and through the small town of Cedar Falls. It's a peaceful drive that I've grown to appreciate over the years. The cemetery itself is beautifully established in 1891, with mature oak trees, well-maintained grounds, and sections that span over a century of local history. The graveside services there are usually quiet affairs, with families gathering under the old trees while I wait respectfully by the hearse. The routine never varied much. I'd arrive at the funeral home by 7 a.m., check the vehicle, review the day's schedule with Mr. Hartwell, and prepare for whatever services were planned. Tuesday mornings were typically Maplewood runs, either transporting someone for a graveside service or returning empty after dropping off flowers or memorial items that families had requested be placed at gravesites. The drive there took about 30 minutes, depending on traffic through Cedar Falls, and the return trip was usually the same. Until it wasn't. The first time I noticed something unusual was 3 months ago, on a Tuesday morning in early spring. I had transported Mrs. Adelaide Chen to Maplewood for her graveside service, stayed for the brief ceremony, and began the return trip to Hartwell's. The service had been small, just her daughter and son-in-law, a few elderly friends, and Pastor Williams from the Methodist Church. Mrs. Chen had been 91 years old, a retired schoolteacher who'd lived quietly in the same house for 50 years. About halfway back, I became aware that the hearse felt different, heavier somehow, as if I were carrying a full load instead of returning empty. The steering required more effort, and I found myself pressing the accelerator harder to maintain the same speed I always drove. I checked the rearview mirror to make sure the back compartment was properly secured. Sometimes the rollers or brackets could shift and create drag, but everything appeared normal. I mentioned it to Ray, our head mechanic, when I returned to the funeral home. He looked over the Lincoln carefully, checked the tire pressure, examined the suspension, and found nothing wrong. "Maybe you're just tired," he suggested. "These long drives can wear on you more than you realize." I accepted his explanation, but the feeling nagged at me. The following Tuesday, the same thing happened. I had delivered Mr. Robert Hutchinson to Maplewood, a veteran who'd requested military honors, and the ceremony had proceeded normally. But on the return trip, that same heavy feeling settled over the hearse. This time, I paid closer attention to the details. The engine strained slightly going up hills, the fuel gauge seemed to drop faster than usual, and there was a subtle vibration in the steering wheel that hadn't been there on the drive to the cemetery. More concerning was what I began to hear about 10 minutes into the return journey. Faint tapping sounds were coming from the back compartment, soft, rhythmic, deliberate, always in sets of 3. Tap, 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 then silence for 30 seconds or so, then tap, tap, tap again. I pulled over at a rest stop and thoroughly inspected the back of the hearse, checking every latch, bolt, and surface. Nothing was loose, nothing was moving, nothing could explain the sound. The tapping continued for the remainder of the drive back to Hartwell's, always in those sets of 3, always soft enough that I had to strain to hear it over the engine noise. When I arrived and parked, the sound stopped immediately. Ray checked the vehicle again, even more thoroughly this time. He had the hearse up on the lift, examining every component of the rear compartment, the suspension, the exhaust system. "I can't find anything that would cause tapping," he told me. "Maybe something from the road is getting caught under the chassis, but I don't see any evidence of that." By the 4th Tuesday, I had begun to dread the return trip from Maplewood. The pattern was always the semi-normal drive to the cemetery, standard graveside service, and then the increasingly unsettling journey back. The hearse would feel heavier, the fuel consumption would increase noticeably, and those soft tapping sounds would begin exactly 10 minutes after leaving the cemetery gates. I started keeping a log, noting the time the tapping began, how long it lasted, and whether there were any variations in the pattern. The results were disturbing in their consistency. The sounds always started at exactly 10 minutes after departure, always followed the same rhythm of 3 taps followed by silence, and always stopped the moment I turned into the Hartwell's parking lot. What made it worse was that I began to feel watched during these return trips. Not from outside the vehicle, but from within, as if someone were sitting in the back compartment, observing me through the partition that separated the driver's section from the area where caskets were transported. I found myself checking the rearview mirror compulsively, expecting to see something that shouldn't be there. The feeling grew stronger with each trip. Sometimes I would catch myself adjusting the rearview mirror as if someone in the back had asked me to, or turning down the radio as if I needed to listen more carefully to something only I could hear. The rational part of my mind insisted that I was experiencing stress-related symptoms. Perhaps the accumulated weight of years spent transporting the deceased was finally affecting me psychologically. But the physical evidence was harder to dismiss. I began documenting the fuel consumption on these Tuesday routes, comparing the miles per gallon on trips to Maplewood versus trips to the other cemeteries I serviced. The Maplewood return trips consistently showed 20% higher fuel usage than identical routes to other locations. The hearse was literally working harder, as if carrying additional weight that didn't show on any scale. I decided to approach Mr. Hartwell about the situation. He'd been running the funeral home for 37 years and had probably encountered every possible vehicle issue. When I described what I'd been experiencing, his expression grew thoughtful. "Maplewood has always been different," he said quietly. "My father ran this business before me, and his father before him. We've been serving that cemetery for almost a century, and there have always been irregularities on the return trips." He pulled out a thick folder from his desk, drawer old service logs dating back decades. "Look at this," he said, pointing to handwritten entries from the 1970s. "Driver reported unusual heaviness on return from Maplewood. Vehicle checked, no mechanical issues found." He flipped through more pages. 1985. Knocking sounds from rear compartment. Maplewood returns only. 1993. Fuel consumption 30% higher on Tuesday routes. The pattern extended back for generations. Different drivers, different vehicles, same phenomena. Always on the return trips from Maplewood. Always unexplained, always documented, but never resolved. "What do you think causes it?" I asked. Mr. Hartwell was quiet for a long moment. "Maplewood is old," he said finally. "Some of the people buried there have been in the ground for over a century, and not all of them went peacefully. There was a period in the early 1900s when several people died under unusual circumstances, accidents, sudden illnesses, situations where families felt the deceased hadn't been properly prepared for their final rest. He showed me more records, death certificates, and burial permits that told stories of lives cut short unexpectedly. Industrial accidents at the old mill, a flu epidemic in 1918, a train derailment in 1923 that killed 14 people. Many of these individuals had been buried quickly, without the customary preparation time or family ceremonies that would normally accompany death. My grandfather used to say that some souls don't rest easy when they feel their departure from this world was too abrupt." Mr. Hartwell continued. "They ride along with our hearses, hoping to return to the world of the living, trying to find their way back to whatever they felt they left unfinished." The explanation chilled me more than the unexplained phenomena themselves. The idea that I had been unknowingly transporting spirits who couldn't accept their death, who clung to the vehicles that traveled between the world of the dead and the world of the living, made every detail of my experience suddenly terrifying. That Tuesday, I approached the return trip from Maplewood with new awareness. The service had been for Maria Santos, a young mother who died in a car accident, leaving behind 3 small children. The graveside ceremony was heartbreaking. Her husband could barely stand, her children too young to understand why their mother wasn't coming home. As I began the return journey, I braced myself for the familiar sensations. Right on schedule, 10 minutes after leaving the cemetery, the hearse grew heavier. The engine strained, the fuel gauge began its rapid descent, and the soft tapping began from the back compartment. Tap, tap, tap. Silence. Tap, tap, tap. But this time, I also heard something else. A faint sound that might have been breathing, or might have been the whisper of fabric against the interior walls of the compartment. And once, just once, I heard what sounded unmistakably like a woman's voice saying a single word, "Please." I gripped the steering wheel tighter and continued driving, my heart racing but my training keeping me focused on the road. In the rearview mirror, I thought I saw movement in the back compartment, a shadow that shouldn't have been there, a suggestion of a figure that appeared and disappeared too quickly to be certain. The voice came again, clearer this time. "Please don't leave me here." It was Maria Santos. I was certain of it. The same voice I'd heard during the funeral planning meetings with her family, the same accent, the same gentle tone she'd used when discussing the arrangements for her children. But Maria Santos was buried in Maplewood Cemetery, 6 feet underground, in a casket I had personally transported to her grave. "Please," the voice said again, and this time I heard tears in it. My babies need me. The remainder of the drive was the longest 30 minutes of my life. The tapping continued, the breathing continued, and twice more I heard Maria's voice pleading to go home to her children. When I finally pulled into the Hartwell's parking lot, everything stopped instantly. The extra weight lifted, the sound ceased, and the oppressive feeling of being watched disappeared. I sat in the driver's seat for 10 minutes, trying to process what had happened. When I finally got out and opened the back compartment, it was empty and silent, showing no sign that anyone or anything had been there. I still drive for Hartwell Funeral Services, and I still make the Tuesday runs to Maplewood Cemetery. The phenomena continue: the heavy feeling, the increased fuel consumption, the soft tapping in sets of 3. But now I understand what's happening, and it changes everything. Some people don't get the chance to say goodbye properly. They leave behind unfinished business, unspoken words, hearts that weren't ready to stop loving. And sometimes they try to find their way back to complete what death interrupted. I don't fight it anymore. When I hear the tapping, I acknowledge it quietly. When I hear the voices, I listen with compassion. And when I feel the weight of souls who aren't ready to rest, I carry them with dignity, just as I do the living. Because in the end, we all need someone to help us find our way home. Death, I've learned, is supposed to be cold. My name is Dr. Rajesh Patel, and I've been the mortuary director at Memorial Hospital for 16 years. It's precise work that requires attention to detail, respect for the deceased, and an understanding that families depend on us to care for their loved ones with dignity during the most difficult time of their lives. The hospital mortuary operates 24 hours a day, maintaining bodies for autopsy, organ donation, or transfer to funeral homes, and I've overseen thousands of cases without incident. Memorial Hospital sits on the edge of downtown, a 12-story building that's been serving our community since 1952. The mortuary occupies the basement level, accessible through a discreet service entrance that keeps our operations separate from the main hospital traffic. We have 6 refrigeration units, each maintaining a constant 38 degrees Fahrenheit, a preparation room, an autopsy suite, and my office where I handle paperwork and coordinate with medical examiners, funeral directors, and families. The work follows predictable rhythms. Bodies arrive from the medical floors, the emergency department, or sometimes from the county coroner's office. We log each case, assign a refrigeration unit, and maintain detailed temperature records to ensure proper preservation. The refrigeration units are monitored continuously both by digital sensors and manual checks every 4 hours. In 16 years, I've never had a temperature regulation failure that lasted more than 30 minutes. My staff consists of 2 full-time technicians and a part-time assistant. We work in shifts to provide round-the-clock coverage, though the overnight hours are typically quiet, except for emergency admissions. I usually arrive at 7 a.m., review the overnight logs, check on any new arrivals, and coordinate the day's activities. The basement stays cool year-round, with the hum of refrigeration units providing constant background noise that I've grown accustomed to over the years. Most people don't think about what happens to the deceased in the hours or days between death and burial. But that time is crucial for families who need to make arrangements, for medical examiners who might require additional examination, and for the hospital itself to ensure proper documentation and release procedures. We serve as guardians during that liminal period, maintaining dignity and ensuring that every protocol is followed correctly. The morning Mrs. Henderson arrived was routine in every way except one. She had passed away during the night shift. An 83-year-old woman who'd been battling pneumonia for 2 weeks. Her death wasn't unexpected, and her family had been prepared for the outcome. The night technician, Maria, had completed the standard intake procedures, photographing any medical devices, logging personal effects, and placing Mrs. Henderson in refrigeration unit number 4. I arrived that morning to find Maria's notes indicating everything had proceeded normally. Mrs. Henderson's body temperature at the time of placement was 91 degrees typical for someone who'd been deceased for about an hour. The refrigeration unit was functioning properly, showing a steady 38 degrees on the digital display. But when I conducted my morning temperature checks, something was wrong. The infrared thermometer read 98.6 degrees when I aimed it at Mrs. Henderson's forehead. I assumed the device was malfunctioning and tried a different thermometer. Same reading. I checked the refrigeration unit's temperature display, 38 degrees, exactly where it should be. But Mrs. Henderson's body temperature was 98.6 degrees. I called Maria to double-check her intake notes. She confirmed that Mrs. Henderson had been cooling normally when she'd completed the placement at 2:15 a.m. I checked on the other bodies in refrigerational, showed the expected temperature drop that occurs after death. Only Mrs. Henderson maintained what appeared to be living body temperature. I documented the anomaly and made a note to monitor the situation. Sometimes unusual medication regimens or medical devices could affect post-mortem temperature regulation, though I'd never seen anything quite like this. I expected the reading to normalize within a few hours as the refrigeration continued its work. By afternoon, Mrs. Henderson's temperature was still 98.6 degrees. Exactly. Not 98.5, not 98.7. Always 98.6. No matter which thermometer I used or where on her body I took the reading. The other bodies in the same refrigeration unit had cooled to the expected 38 degrees, but Mrs. Henderson remained at perfect living body temperature. I contacted Dr. Walsh, the attending physician who'd pronounced Mrs. Henderson's death, to review her medical history. She'd had no unusual treatments, no experimental medications, no implanted devices that might explain the temperature anomaly. Her death had been straightforward respiratory failure due to pneumonia, witnessed by 2 nurses and properly documented. That evening, I decided to stay late and monitor Mrs. Henderson personally. I wanted to understand what was happening before, involving other staff or alarming the family. I set up a chair in the main corridor and conducted temperature checks every 30 minutes. Each reading was identical, 98.6 degrees. Around 9 p.m., I noticed something else disturbing. When I opened the refrigeration unit to take another temperature reading, I felt warmth radiating from Mrs. Henderson's body. Not the ambient warmth you might feel from a heating malfunction, but the specific, unmistakable warmth of living human body heat. I held my hand 6 inches above her chest and felt the same sensation you'd experience standing near someone who was sleeping. I checked the refrigeration unit's mechanics thoroughly. The compressor was running normally, the temperature sensors were accurate, and the other bodies were properly chilled. Only Mrs. Henderson generated this inexplicable warmth. By the second day, I was deeply concerned. Mrs. Henderson's temperature remained exactly 98.6 degrees, and the warmth radiating from her body seemed to be increasing. I consulted with the chief medical examiner, who agreed to visit and examine the situation personally. Dr. Elizabeth Carver had been a medical examiner for 23 years and had encountered numerous unusual post-mortem phenomena. She arrived that afternoon with her own equipment and conducted a comprehensive examination. Her infrared thermometer confirmed my readings. Her assessment of the refrigeration unit verified that it was functioning correctly. "I've never seen anything like this," she admitted after completing her examination. "The body shows all other signs of normal post-mortem changes: lividity, rigor mortis onset and resolution, but the temperature regulation appears to be completely unaffected by external cooling." Dr. Carver recommended keeping detailed hourly logs and continuing to monitor the situation. She also suggested that we might need to consider emergency burial if the anomaly posed any health or safety risks, though she couldn't identify any specific hazards. On the third day, something changed. During my morning temperature check, I felt something that made my blood run cold. As I held the thermometer near Mrs. Henderson's forehead, I felt a soft, warm exhalation against my hand. It was unmistakable, the gentle, rhythmic breath of someone sleeping. I immediately called Dr. Carver, who arrived within an hour. Together, we conducted the most thorough examination possible. There was no pulse, no heartbeat detectable by stethoscope or EKG, no brain activity. But when we both held our hands near Mrs. Henderson's face, we felt the same thing: warm, regular breathing. "This is impossible," Dr. Carver whispered, but she couldn't deny what we were both experiencing. The breathing sensation was subtle but consistent. Every few seconds, we felt warm air against our palms, as if Mrs. Henderson were exhaling in her sleep. Her chest didn't rise or fall. Her airways showed no movement, but the breath was there, warm, human, and completely unexplainable. I checked the other bodies again. All were cold, still showing no signs of any similar phenomena. Only Mrs. Henderson continued to generate warmth and this phantom breathing that shouldn't exist. That night, I stayed in the mortuary past midnight, trying to understand what was happening. I sat beside refrigeration unit 4, feeling that impossible warmth and the soft brush of breath against my hands every few seconds. The experience was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. Around 2 a.m., I heard something that changed everything. It was faint, barely audible over the hum of the refrigeration units, but unmistakable. The sound of someone saying my name. "Dr. Patel." The voice was soft, elderly, with the gentle accent I remembered from Mrs. Henderson's family visits during her hospital stay. I looked around the empty mortuary, confirming that I was alone, then returned my attention to the refrigeration unit. "Dr. Patel," the voice said again, and this time I was certain it was coming from Mrs. Henderson. I opened the unit and leaned closer. Her face was peaceful, eyes closed, showing no sign of movement or consciousness. But the warmth radiating from her body was stronger now, and the breathing sensation was more pronounced. "I'm not ready," she whispered, though her lips didn't move and her voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I stood frozen, my scientific training warring with the impossible evidence of my senses. Mrs. Henderson was dead. I had confirmed it myself. Dr. Carver had confirmed it. Every medical indicator supported that conclusion. But something essential, something that made her who she was, hadn't departed with her physical death. "My granddaughter's wedding," the voice continued. "I promised I'd be there. It's next month. I can't leave yet." I remembered Mrs. Henderson mentioning the wedding during her hospital stay. Her granddaughter was getting married in 6 weeks, and Mrs. Henderson had been disappointed that her illness might prevent her from attending. Now, somehow, some part of her consciousness was refusing to accept that death had ended her ability to keep that promise. "I understand," I whispered, feeling foolish but compelled to respond. The warmth seemed to intensify for a moment, and I felt what might have been gratitude in the soft breath against my hands. For the remainder of the night, I sat with Mrs. Henderson, monitoring her impossible vital signs and listening to her occasional whispered words about the wedding, her granddaughter, and her determination to be present for the ceremony. As dawn approached, the warmth began to fade gradually, and the breathing sensation became more intermittent. By morning, Mrs. Henderson's body temperature had finally begun to drop. Within 6 hours, she had cooled to the expected 38 degrees, and the mysterious breathing sensation had stopped entirely. Dr. Carver returned to conduct a final examination and confirmed that all anomalies had resolved. The family completed their arrangements, and Mrs. Henderson was transferred to the funeral home that afternoon. I never told them about the temperature anomaly or the impossible breathing I had felt. Some experiences are too strange to share, and some mysteries are better left as personal understanding rather than public knowledge. But I've never forgotten those 3 days, or the way Mrs. Henderson's determination to keep a promise had somehow overcome the finality of death. In my 16 years of mortuary work, I've learned that the human spirit is more resilient than we understand, and that love can sometimes delay even the inevitable. I still check temperatures carefully on every body that comes through our mortuary. And sometimes, late at night when I'm working alone, I remember the warmth of breath that shouldn't exist and wonder how many other promises are strong enough to hold back the cold. Some things refuse to be buried, no matter how deep you dig the grave. My name is Claire Morrison, and I've been the head groundskeeper at Oakwood Cemetery for 9 years. It's honest work that keeps me outdoors, away from the complications of office politics and customer service. The cemetery spans 38 acres of gently rolling hills, with sections dating back to 1871. Most people think tending a cemetery would be depressing, but I find it peaceful. The dead don't complain about the landscaping or ask for special accommodations. They rest quietly while I maintain their final resting place with the respect they deserve. Oakwood serves the entire county, with burial sections organized alphabetically from A through J. Section C, where I spend most of my maintenance time, contains graves from the 1920s through the 1950s. It's one of the prettier areas, with mature maple trees that provide shade in summer and brilliant color in autumn. The headstones in Section C are mostly traditional granite and marble, well maintained by families who still visit regularly. My daily routine starts at 6 a.m. with a walkthrough of the entire cemetery, checking for any overnight damage, vandalism, or maintenance issues. I carry a clipboard to note areas that need attention-fallen branches, damaged headstones, irrigation problems, or litter that needs to be removed. After the initial survey, I focus on specific tasks: mowing, trimming, flower bed maintenance, or repairs. The work is seasonal but consistent, and I've developed an efficient system that keeps Oakwood looking dignified year-round. The office is a small building near the main entrance where I keep tools, supplies, and the detailed maps that show every plot and grave. I also maintain records of which families have prepaid for ongoing maintenance and which graves need special attention during holidays. The cemetery manager, Mrs. Chen, handles burials and family communications, while I focus on the physical upkeep of the grounds. Section C requires extra attention because several of the older graves have settling issues, and the maple trees drop considerable debris throughout the year. The fencing that separates Section C from the access road is decorative ironwork that needs regular inspection for rust and damage. It's along this fence that families sometimes leave flowers or personal items when they visit graves near the perimeter. I've grown accustomed to finding the occasional memorial item that's been displaced by wind or animals' flowers, small flags, religious medallions, or photographs in weather-resistant frames. Usually, I can determine which grave the item belongs to based on proximity and recent family visits. When I can't identify the owner, I place lost items in a collection box at the office where families can retrieve them. But the black dress was different from anything I'd encountered before. I first noticed it on a Tuesday morning in early October, hanging on the iron fence that borders Section C. It was a simple black dress, the kind worn to funerals' conservative cut, long sleeves, reaching to about knee length. The fabric appeared to be wool or a wool blend, well made but not expensive. What struck me immediately was how carefully it had been placed. The dress hung perfectly straight on the fence, as if someone had taken time to arrange it properly, rather than simply draping it there carelessly. The dress was positioned so that it faced directly toward the interior of Section C, specifically toward a cluster of graves about 50 yards away. I checked my plot map and determined that the dress was oriented toward grave C12, the final resting place of Eleanor Whitman, who had died in 1947 at the age of 28. Mrs. Whitman's grave was marked by a simple granite headstone and was rarely visited, according to my maintenance logs. I assumed someone from the Whitman family had left the dress as a memorial gesture and would return to collect it. I made a note in my daily log and continued with my regular duties. When I completed my afternoon check, the dress was still there, hanging motionless in the still October air. The next morning, the dress had moved. It was still on the Section C fence, still facing toward grave C12, but now it hung from a different section of ironwork, about 20 feet from where I'd found it the previous day. The positioning was identical, perfectly straight, carefully arranged, oriented directly toward Eleanor Whitman's grave, but it had definitely changed location during the night. I examined the fence where the dress now hung and where it had been the day before. There was no sign of damage, no bent iron or disturbed ground that might indicate vandalism or forced entry. The cemetery gates are locked from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., and I had the only key besides Mrs. Chen. No one should have been able to access the grounds during the night. I decided to ask Mrs. Chen if any Whitman family members had contacted the office about leaving memorial items. She checked the family files and found that Eleanor Whitman had no living relatives on record. Her parents had died in the 1960s. She had never married, and there were no siblings listed in the burial documentation. The grave hadn't been visited by anyone in the 15 years Mrs. Chen had been managing the cemetery. That afternoon, I made a point to examine Eleanor Whitman's grave more carefully. The headstone was simple granite with her name, birth date of 1919, and death date of 1947. Below her name was a single word, beloved. No family names, no religious symbols, no indication of her profession or relationships. The grave was well maintained by the cemetery's general upkeep, but showed no signs of recent family attention or flowers, no personal items, no evidence that anyone had visited recently. The third morning, the dress had moved again. This time it hung from a section of fence closer to the main path, still facing Eleanor's grave, but from a different angle. The dress appeared identical to the one I'd been observing. Same black fabric, same conservative cut, same careful arrangement. But the relocation during locked overnight hours was becoming increasingly disturbing. I decided to document the situation more systematically. I took photographs of the dress in each location, noting the exact time and fence position. I also began checking the cemetery's perimeter more carefully during my morning rounds, looking for any signs of unauthorized entry. The fence is 6 feet tall and extends around the entire property, with 3 locked gates. I found no evidence that anyone had climbed over or cut through the fencing. By the end of the first week, the dress had appeared in 7 different locations along the Section C fence. Always the same dress, always facing Eleanor Whitman's grave, always positioned with the same careful attention to arrangement. I began staying later in the evenings, hoping to observe whoever was moving the dress, but I never saw anyone near Section C after closing time. The second week brought a new level of strangeness. Not only did the dress continue moving to different fence positions each night, but it began appearing in locations that should have been impossible to reach. One morning, I found it hanging from a section of fence that was separated from the access path by a decorative pond and flower bed. No footprints marked the soft soil around the pond, and the flower bed showed no signs of disturbance. Another morning, the dress appeared on a section of fence directly beneath a large maple tree whose branches extended over the ironwork. To reach that position, someone would have had to climb the tree and lower the dress down, or somehow throw it with perfect accuracy to catch on the fence posts. Both scenarios seemed unlikely, especially given the precise arrangement of the fabric. I started researching Eleanor Whitman's death, hoping to understand why someone might be leaving the dress near her grave. Mrs. Chen helped me access the old burial records and newspaper archives from 1947. What I found was troubling. Eleanor Whitman had died in October of 1947 under unusual circumstances. She had been found dead in her apartment, dressed in her best black dress, apparently waiting for someone who never arrived. The newspaper report mentioned that she had been expecting a visitor that evening, a man she had been corresponding with through a pen pal service. The man never came forward after her death, and police were unable to locate him. The coroner had ruled Eleanor's death a heart attack brought on by extreme emotional distress. Neighbors reported that she had been excited about meeting her correspondent for the first time, had spent days preparing for his visit, and had been wearing her finest black dress when they found her the next morning. She had died alone, dressed for a meeting that never happened, waiting for someone who may never have existed. Understanding Eleanor's story made the appearance of the black dress even more unsettling. It seemed as though someone was recreating the circumstances of her death, placing the same type of dress she had been wearing in positions where it would face her grave, as if she were still waiting for that promised visitor. On Friday of the second week, I decided to remove the dress entirely. I had documented its locations, researched its possible significance, and found no living person who could explain its presence. The dress was becoming a distraction from my regular duties and was starting to affect my sleep. I would arrive each morning wondering where it would appear next. and I found myself checking the Section C fence multiple times throughout the day. I collected the dress during my afternoon rounds, noting that it felt heavier than expected and retained a faint scent of lavender and mothballs, as if it had been stored in an old cedar chest. The fabric was higher quality than I had initially thought, with careful stitching and attention to detail that suggested it had been someone's treasured garment rather than an inexpensive funeral outfit. I placed the dress in a garbage bag and disposed of it in the cemetery's dumpster, which would be emptied the following Monday. I felt a mixture of relief and unease as I threw it away, as if I were discarding something that deserved more respectful treatment. But the daily mystery had become too disruptive to tolerate any longer. That evening, I returned home to my small house about 3 miles from the cemetery. It's a quiet neighborhood where I've lived alone since my divorce 4 years ago, with a small front porch where I keep a chair and a few potted plants. As I approached my front door around 6:30 p.m., I saw something that made my stomach drop. The black dress was hanging from my porch railing. It was the same dress I had thrown away hours earlier, same fabric, same cut, same careful arrangement. But now it hung on my personal property, facing toward the direction of Oakwood Cemetery. Pinned to the front of the dress was a small piece of paper with handwritten text in faded blue ink. "She's still waiting." I stood on my front walkway for several minutes, trying to process what I was seeing. The dress couldn't have traveled from the cemetery dumpster to my porch on its own. Someone had retrieved it and brought it to my home. But that someone would have had to know where I lived, would have had to access the cemetery after hours to retrieve the dress from the dumpster, and would have had to visit my house without my knowledge. The handwriting on the note was feminine, careful, cursive, that looked like it had been written with an old fountain pen. The paper appeared aged, with the slight yellowing that comes from decades of storage. It looked exactly like the kind of stationery that might have been used for correspondence in 1947. I brought the dress inside and examined it more carefully under good lighting. The fabric was definitely wool, with a label sewn inside that read, "Macy's, New York, 1946. The dress was in remarkable condition for being over 70 years old, with no signs of wear, fading, or moth damage. It looked exactly like something a young woman in 1947 might have worn for a special occasion. The note troubled me even more than the dress itself. The phrase, "she's still waiting," seemed to confirm my growing suspicion that Eleanor Whitman was somehow connected to these appearances. Perhaps she was still waiting for the visitor who had never arrived in 1947, still dressed in her finest black dress, still hoping for a meeting that death had prevented. I kept the dress that night, unsure what else to do with it. I placed it carefully in my bedroom closet, treating it with the respect I would show any historical artifact. As I tried to sleep, I found myself thinking about Eleanor Whitman, alone in her apartment in 1947, dressed in her best clothes and waiting for someone who would never come. The next morning, I decided to return the dress to Eleanor's grave. If she was somehow responsible for its appearances, perhaps placing it directly on her final resting place would end the disturbances. I arrived at the cemetery early, before anyone else would be around, and walked directly to grave C12. I laid the dress carefully across Eleanor Whitman's headstone, arranging it as respectfully as possible. As I stood there, I felt an overwhelming sense of sadness, not my own emotion, but something that seemed to emanate from the grave itself. For just a moment, I thought I heard the faint sound of someone crying, though I was alone in the cemetery. I haven't seen the black dress since that morning 3 months ago, but sometimes, when I'm working in Section C, I catch the scent of lavender and mothballs carried on the wind. And on quiet evenings when I sit on my front porch, I think about Eleanor Whitman, still waiting after 77 years for a visitor who promised to come but never arrived. Some promises, I've learned, outlast the people who made them, and some kinds of waiting never end, no matter how long the vigil lasts. The dead speak loudest when you're standing in their world. My name is Tommy Brennan, and I've been digging graves at Restwood Cemetery for 7 years. It's physical work that keeps me outdoors and away from the complications of modern Lafino computers, no office politics, Just honest labor with a shovel and the quiet company of people who found their final rest. Most folks think it's morbid work, but I find dignity in preparing the final resting place for someone's loved one. Every grave I dig serves a family in their time of grief, and that responsibility has always felt sacred to me. Restwood Cemetery has been serving our county since 1894, with rolling hills covered in mature oak and maple trees that provide natural beauty and peaceful shade. The older sections contain weathered headstones and elaborate monuments from the early 1900s, while the newer areas feature modern granite markers and bronze plaques. I work primarily in sections D through G, where most current burials take place, though sometimes I'm called to dig in the historic areas when families purchase plots near their ancestors. The work follows predictable rhythms, tied to the seasons, and the inevitable reality that people pass away with consistent frequency. I usually dig 2 to 3 graves per week, depending on the season. Winter months are busier due to flu and cold-related deaths among the elderly, while summer tends to be quieter except for occasional accidents or sudden illnesses. Each grave must be precisely excavated to 6 feet deep, 4 feet wide, and 8 feet long, with straight walls and level floors that allow caskets to be lowered with dignity. I work with a crew of 3 other men: Jim, who's been at Restwood for 22 years, Carlos, who handles the heavy equipment, and Dale, our newest hire who started last spring. We coordinate with the funeral directors to ensure graves are ready for services, and we handle the actual burial process while families gather for graveside ceremonies. It requires timing, respect, and attention to detail that most people never think about until they need our services. My tools are simple but essential: a long-handled spade for initial excavation, a trenching shovel for precise wall work, a pickaxe for breaking up difficult soil, and a measuring tape to ensure exact dimensions. The physical demands keep me in good shape, and after 7 years I can judge depths and measurements by sight almost as accurately as with instruments. There's a rhythm to the work that I've grown to appreciate: the solid impact of the shovel, the methodical removal of soil, the gradual descent into the earth. My father, Patrick Brennan, had worked construction his entire life before lung cancer took him 3 years ago. He would have understood the satisfaction of manual labor and the pride in doing necessary work well. Dad always said that honest work with your hands built character in ways that desk jobs never could. When he died, we honored his wishes for cremation, and his ashes rest in an urn on my mother's mantelpiece, not buried in any cemetery. The first time I heard his voice, I thought it was my imagination. I was digging a grave for Eleanor Martinez, an elderly woman who'd passed away peacefully in her sleep. The funeral was scheduled for 2 p.m., and I'd started early to ensure everything would be ready. Restwood soil is generally cooperative dark earth that holds its shape well and drains properly. But this particular plot in Section F had harder ground that required more effort than usual. As I worked my way down, measuring carefully to ensure proper depth, I reached the 6-foot mark and paused to check my work. The walls were straight, the corners were square, and the floor was level. I was standing in the bottom of the grave, surrounded by earth walls on 4 sides, when I heard someone call my name. "Tommy." The voice was clear, familiar, and seemed to come from directly beneath my feet. It was my father's voice, the same tone he'd used when calling me in for dinner as a child, the same slight rasp from years of smoking that had eventually led to his cancer. But my father was dead, and his ashes weren't buried anywhere. I looked up from the grave to see if one of my coworkers had called to me, but Jim and Carlos were working on the other side of the cemetery, and Dale was operating the backhoe near Section G. The funeral party for Mrs. Martinez hadn't arrived yet, so there was no one nearby who could have spoken. I dismissed the experience as auditory hallucination brought on by physical exertion and the psychological weight of working in graves. The human mind can play tricks when you're surrounded by reminders of mortality, especially when you're dealing with your own grief. I finished preparing the grave and moved on with my day. But it happened again the following week. I was digging for Robert Chen, a middle-aged man who died in a car accident. The soil in Section E was easier to work, and I made good progress toward the required depth. When I reached exactly 6 feet and paused to measure, I heard the voice again. "Tommy." This time I was certain it was my father's voice, calling from somewhere beneath the grave floor. The sound was muffled, as if coming from deep underground, but unmistakably his. I stood perfectly still, listening, but heard nothing more. When I climbed out of the grave to check my surroundings, I found the cemetery empty, except for my coworkers in the distance. I began paying closer attention during subsequent excavations. The voice didn't occur every time I dug a grave, only about half the time, and always when I reached exactly 6 feet deep. Never at 5 feet and 11 inches, never at 6 feet and 1 inch. Always precisely at the regulation burial depth. Always my father's voice. Always calling my name once before falling silent. The logical explanations I considered all fell short. Sound doesn't travel upward through 6 feet of solid earth. My father's ashes weren't buried at Restwood or any other cemetery. Auditory hallucinations typically don't repeat with such specific timing and consistency. Whatever was happening seemed to follow rules that didn't align with normal physical reality. After a month of intermittent voice experiences, something else began happening that was even more disturbing. During funeral services, when I was required to be present for the burial process, I started noticing discrepancies in the number of people attending. I would climb down into the grave to guide the casket lowering mechanism, and when I climbed back out, there would be one additional person standing with the mourners. The first time I noticed this was during the burial of Janet Williams, an elderly woman whose service was attended by about 15 family members and friends. I climbed into the grave to ensure the casket was properly positioned, heard my father's voice call my name from below, and climbed out to find 16 people gathered around the graveside. The additional person was always standing slightly apart from the main group, dressed appropriately for a funeral, and appeared to belong there naturally. But I was certain the count had been different when I went down into the grave. I began making mental notes of funeral attendance before climbing into graves. When the numbers changed consistently, I started doing discrete head counts before and after each burial where I heard my father's voice. The pattern held true every time one additional mourner would appear while I was standing at the 6-foot depth. The extra attendees varied in age, gender, and appearance, but they all shared certain characteristics. They stood quietly at the edge of the gathering, never spoke during the ceremony, and always wore dark, formal clothing appropriate for funerals. Most unsettling was that they seemed to belong. Their family members didn't question their presence, funeral directors didn't ask for their identification, and they participated in the ceremony as if they had every right to be there. I tried discreetly asking other cemetery workers if they noticed anything unusual about funeral attendance, but no one else seemed aware of the additional mourners. Jim, who'd been present at dozens of these services, insisted that the guest counts were normal and that I was probably just miscounting in the stress of managing the burial logistics. The situation escalated during the funeral of Michael O'Connor, a young father who died unexpectedly of a heart attack. The service was larger than usual, with approximately 30 people gathered for the graveside ceremony. When I climbed into the grave and heard my father's voice, I took extra care to observe the mourners when I climbed out. Not only was there an additional person standing with the group, but I recognized him. The extra mourner was my father. He stood at the back of the gathering, wearing the navy blue suit he'd been buried in 3 years earlier, looking exactly as he had during his final weeks before the cancer took him. He was watching me with the same gentle expression I remembered from childhood, but he made no attempt to approach or communicate beyond his presence. I stood frozen beside the open grave, staring at him while the funeral director continued the burial ceremony. My father's image was clear and solid, not translucent or ghostly, but appearing as real as any other person present. When the ceremony concluded and mourners began to disperse, he turned and walked away with the crowd, disappearing among the cars in the parking area. I followed as quickly as I could without disrupting the funeral, but by the time I reached the parking lot, I couldn't locate him among the departing vehicles. I checked with the funeral director to see if he'd noticed the additional attendee, but he insisted the guest count had been normal and that no one fitting my father's description had been present. That evening, I called my mother to ask if she'd noticed anything unusual about Dad's urn, or if she'd had any experiences that might suggest his spirit was somehow active. She was concerned about my mental health and suggested I might be working too hard or dealing with delayed grief responses. The conversation left me feeling more isolated and uncertain about what I was experiencing. The pattern continued over the following months. Every time I dug a grave and heard my father's voice at the 6-foot depth, an additional mourner would appear during the funeral service. Sometimes I recognized the person, former cemetery workers who died, elderly community members I remembered from my childhood, even people whose graves I dug in previous years. Other times, the extra attendees were strangers, but they always carried themselves with the quiet dignity of people who belonged at the gathering. The most disturbing realization was that these additional mourners all seemed to be dead. I began researching the people I recognized among the extra attendees and discovered that every one of them had died within the past several years. Former cemetery groundskeeper Ed Wilson had passed away 2 years ago from diabetes complications. Mrs. Dorothy Hartley, whom I remembered from my childhood neighborhood, had died 18 months ago in a nursing home. Even people I didn't initially recognize could be traced through obituaries and cemetery records to confirm their deaths. The dead were attending funerals at Restwood Cemetery, appearing as mourners while I worked in graves that reached precisely 6 feet deep and heard my father calling my name from below. The voice from beneath the earth seemed to be summoning them, creating a gathering of the deceased who came to witness new arrivals to their eternal community. I considered several possibilities for what might be happening. Perhaps the specific depth of 6 feet created some kind of acoustic phenomenon that allowed communication between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. Maybe my father's voice was calling not just to me, but to others who had passed away, inviting them to attend burial ceremonies for people joining their ranks. Or perhaps the act of digging graves to regulation depth was opening temporary doorways between worlds, allowing the deceased to cross over briefly and participate in rituals that marked the transition from life to death. My father's voice might be serving as a guide or announcer, informing the dead community about new arrivals who needed to be welcomed properly. The most recent funeral where this occurred was last Tuesday, for Sarah Kim, a young nurse who died in a motorcycle accident. When I reached 6 feet and heard my father call my name, I climbed out to find not just one additional mourner, but 3. My father stood with Ed Wilson and Mrs. Place, Dorothy Hartley, all watching the burial ceremony with the quiet respect of people who understood the significance of the transition being marked. After the service, as the living mourners departed, the 3 additional attendees remained by the graveside. My father looked directly at me and nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement and perhaps approval for the work I was doing. Then they walked together toward the older sections of the cemetery, disappearing among the headstones and monuments where so many others had found their final rest. I still dig graves at Restwood Cemetery, and I still hear my father's voice when I reach 6 feet deep. But now I understand that my work serves 2 communities, the living who need graves prepared for their loved ones, and the dead who need witnesses to welcome new members to their eternal gathering. Every grave I dig opens a doorway, and every funeral becomes a reunion between worlds. My father's voice calls from below not to frighten me, but to announce arrivals to those who wait in the earth, ensuring that no one enters death alone or unwelcomed. The dead, I've learned, take care of their own. Some photographs capture more than what the living eye can see. My name is Janet Walsh, and I've been photographing funeral services for 8 years. It's specialized work that requires sensitivity, discretion, and an understanding that families need these images to process their grief and preserve memories of their final farewell. Most people don't think about funeral photography until they need it, but memorial services are often the last time extended families gather together, and these photographs become treasured records of shared mourning and remembrance. I work primarily with Morrison Chapel, a historic funeral home that's been serving our community since 1928. The chapel itself is beautiful high ceilings with exposed wooden beams, stained glass windows that cast colored light across the pews, and an altar area that provides dignity for both religious and secular services. The building has character that newer funeral homes lack, with details like hand-carved woodwork and original hardwood floors that photograph beautifully in natural light. My approach to funeral photography emphasizes discretion and respect. I use a telephoto lens to capture moments from a distance, avoiding flash that might disrupt the ceremony, and focus on documenting the emotional connections between family members rather than the deceased. Families want images that show their loved one being honored and remembered, surrounded by people who cared about them. These photographs often become the only visual record of who attended the service and how the community came together to support the grieving family. The technical aspects of my work require careful attention to lighting, composition, and timing. Funeral services often take place in challenging lighting conditions, dim chapel interiors, mixed lighting from windows and artificial sources, and situations where I can't control the environment or ask people to pose. I've developed techniques for working quietly and unobtrusively, capturing authentic moments without drawing attention to myself or the camera. Most of my clients are referred through the funeral home, though sometimes families contact me directly after recommendations from friends who've used my services. I typically arrive 30 minutes before the service to assess the lighting and identify optimal positions for photography. During the ceremony, I move carefully around the perimeter of the chapel, documenting the gathering without interfering with the flow of the service or the family's mourning process. The equipment I use is professional grade but not ostentatious Canon camera body, with several lenses, backup equipment in case of malfunctions, and extra batteries and memory cards for longer services. I shoot in RAW format to ensure maximum flexibility during post-processing, and I maintain strict protocols for backing up and organizing images to prevent any possibility of losing irreplaceable memorial photographs. Morrison Chapel has become my primary location over the years, and I've grown familiar with the lighting conditions, acoustics, and sight lines that affect my photography. The funeral director, Mr. Morrison, inherited the business from his father and grandfather, and he understands the value of professional memorial photography. He's always been supportive of my work and helpful in coordinating with families who want photographic documentation of their services. The chapel hosts 2 to 3 services per week, with additional memorial gatherings during holidays when families choose to hold remembrance ceremonies for anniversaries of deaths. I've photographed hundreds of services there, documenting the final farewells for people from all walks of life, elderly community members who lived full lives, middle-aged individuals taken by illness or accident, and occasionally young people whose deaths remind everyone of life's fragility. The first time I noticed something unusual in my photographs, I assumed it was a technical error. I had been documenting the funeral service for Robert Chen, a retired teacher who died peacefully in his sleep at age 78. The service was well attended, with about 40 family members and former students gathered in the chapel. The lighting was good, the ceremony proceeded smoothly, and I captured several meaningful moments of shared grief and remembrance. When I reviewed the images that evening during post-processing, I noticed something strange in one of the wide shots I'd taken of the congregation. Behind the gathered mourners, standing near the back wall of the chapel, was an additional figure I didn't remember seeing during the service. The woman appeared to be in her 30s, wearing a dark dress with a style that looked distinctly vintage shoulder pads, a fitted waist, and a length that suggested 1940s fashion. She was holding what appeared to be a camera, positioned as if she were also documenting the service. Her posture was professional, alert, and focused on the proceedings, but her clothing and the style of camera she held looked decades out of place in a modern funeral service. I examined the image carefully, wondering if someone had attended the service in period costume, for sentimental reasons perhaps, wearing an outfit that had belonged to the deceased's spouse or family member. But I couldn't recall seeing anyone dressed in vintage clothing during the actual ceremony, and I typically notice details that might affect my photographic compositions. I checked the other images from the same service and found the woman appeared in 3 more shots, always in the background, always holding her camera, always positioned as if she were working alongside me to document the ceremony. In each image, her clothing and equipment looked increasingly anachronistic compared to the modern mourners and chapel furnishings. I mentioned the unusual figure to Mr. Morrison when I delivered the finished photographs to the funeral home. He reviewed the images with interest, but couldn't identify the woman or explain her vintage appearance. He suggested she might have been a distant relative who preferred older styles of dress, though he admitted he hadn't noticed anyone matching that description during the service. The following week brought another funeral, and the mysterious photographer appeared again. This time, the service was for Margaret O'Sullivan, an elderly woman who'd been active in local historical societies. The gathering was smaller, about 25 people, and I had clear sightlines throughout the chapel during the entire ceremony. I made a conscious effort to observe all attendees carefully, looking for anyone who might match the description of the woman from my previous photographs. I saw no one wearing vintage clothing or carrying an old-style camera during the service. But when I processed the images that evening, she was there again, standing in different locations throughout the chapel, always with her camera, always dressed in the same 1940s style. This time, I could see more details of her equipment. A large format camera with a bellows design that hadn't been commonly used since the 1950s. The woman's positioning in these new photographs was particularly unsettling. She appeared to be coordinating with my movements, capturing angles and moments that complemented my own photographic coverage. In one image, she was positioned to get a clear shot of the family while I was focused on a wider view of the congregation. In another, she seemed to be documenting mourners that I hadn't been able to see from my position. It was as if someone else was working the same event, photographing the service from a different perspective, but remaining completely invisible to everyone present except my camera. I began researching the history of Morrison Chapel, hoping to find some explanation for the vintage-dressed photographer who kept appearing in my images. Mr. Morrison provided access to the chapel's historical records, which included photographs, newspaper clippings, and business documents dating back to the building's construction. What I discovered in those records changed everything I thought I understood about my mysterious subject. From 1928 through 1943, Morrison Chapel employed a staff photographer named Helen Varga. The records included several photographs of Helen at work, documenting funeral services with the same professional attention to discretion and respect that I tried to bring to my own work. In these historical images, Helen was clearly visible wearing the same style of dark dress I'd been seeing in my photographs, operating the same large format camera with bellows design. Helen Varga had died in November of 1943 during a tuberculosis outbreak that claimed several local residents. According to the chapel records, she had been photographing a funeral service on the morning she fell ill, completed her work despite feeling unwell, and died 3 days later. The funeral director's notes from that time indicated that Helen had been devoted to her work and had expressed concern about who would continue documenting services for grieving families. The last entry in Helen's employment file was a handwritten note from the original Mr. Morrison. Helen's dedication to preserving final memories for families was unmatched. She understood that these photographs serve purposes beyond simple documentation. They capture the love and respect that surrounds every life at its conclusion. I compared the historical photographs of Helen Varga with the mysterious figure appearing in my recent images. The resemblance was unmistakable: same facial features, same professional posture, same careful attention to positioning and composition. Helen Varga, who had died 79 years ago, was somehow continuing to photograph funeral services at Morrison Chapel. Armed with this knowledge, I approached my next assignment with a mixture of anticipation and unease. The service was for James Peterson, a World War II veteran whose military funeral would include honor guards and ceremonial elements. I arrived early, set up my equipment, and waited to see if Helen would appear again. During the service, I found myself scanning the chapel constantly, looking for any sign of Helen's presence. I saw nothing unusual with my naked eye, just the gathered mourners, the military honor guard, and the solemn dignity of a veteran's final ceremony. But I had the persistent feeling that I was not alone in documenting the event. When I processed the images that evening, Helen was present in more photographs than ever before. She appeared in nearly every shot, always positioned to capture angles I couldn't access, always focused on moments I might have missed. In one particularly striking image, she was photographing the presentation of the flag to Mr. Peterson's widow, while I had been focused on the honor guard salute. But the most unsettling discovery was in the final image of the Syria wide shot of the chapel as mourners were beginning to depart. Helen was clearly visible in the background, but instead of holding her camera, she was looking directly at my position. Her expression was calm, professional, and unmistakably acknowledging my presence. For the first time, she seemed aware that someone else was documenting the same ceremony. The following morning, I found an envelope slipped under my office door. Inside was a single black and white photograph vintage image of Morrison Chapel during a funeral service from what appeared to be the 1940s. The composition was masterful, capturing both the solemnity of the ceremony and the love evident in the gathered mourners. On the back of the photograph, written in faded blue ink, was a brief note. "Thank you for continuing the work. Families need these memories preserved with dignity. HV." I've continued photographing funeral services at Morrison Chapel, and Helen Varga continues to appear in my images. We work together now, she and I, documenting the final farewells with the respect and care that grieving families deserve. Sometimes I catch glimpses of her positioning in my peripheral vision, and occasionally I adjust my own coverage to complement what I sense she might be capturing from her perspective. The families never know that their memorial services are being documented by two photographers separated by nearly 8 decades. But I've noticed that my images have become more complete, more emotionally resonant, as if Helen's decades of experience are somehow informing my own approach to this sacred work. Some responsibilities, I've learned, transcend death, and some dedication to preserving final memories continues long after the photographer herself has found her final rest. Helen Varga died in 1943, but her commitment to documenting love and loss with dignity lives on in every memorial service we photograph together. Some numbers carry curses that no amount of paperwork can explain. My name is David Martinez, and I've been the records clerk at Green Hill Cemetery for 4 years. It's detail-oriented work that requires precision, patience, and an understanding that families depend on accurate documentation during the most difficult times of their lives. I maintain burial records, coordinate plot sales, track maintenance schedules, and ensure that every aspect of the cemetery's operations follows state regulations and internal protocols. Green Hill Cemetery has been serving our community since 1937, with 9 sections designated A through I that contain approximately 3,000 burial plots. The cemetery spans 45 acres of gently rolling hills, with mature oak and pine trees that provide natural beauty and peaceful shade. Each section contains rows of plots numbered 1 through 25, with premium locations near shade trees, water features, or scenic overlooks commanding higher prices from families seeking the most desirable final resting places for their loved ones. My office is located in the administration building near the main entrance, a modest brick structure that houses all cemetery records, dating back to the original land purchase and development. The filing system combines modern computer databases with physical documents that include original deeds, burial permits, maintenance logs, and correspondence with families. State law requires that burial records be maintained indefinitely, so I work with files spanning 8 decades of cemetery operations. The work follows predictable patterns tied to seasonal death rates and family planning cycles. Spring and fall are busier periods when families often purchase plots in advance or make arrangements for elderly relatives. Summer tends to be quieter for advance sales but busier for actual burials due to increased accidents and heat-related deaths among vulnerable populations. Winter brings steady business from flu season and weather-related incidents, particularly among the elderly. Plot sales require careful coordination between family preferences, available inventory, and pricing structures that reflect location desirability. Corner plots, shaded areas, and positions near the cemetery's central memorial garden command premium prices, while plots in newer sections or areas requiring more maintenance are priced accordingly. I maintain detailed maps showing sold plots, available inventory, and reserved sections for future development. The computer database tracks current information, but many historical details exist only in handwritten ledgers and file folders that previous clerks maintained before digital record-keeping became standard. These physical documents contain valuable information about plot restrictions, soil conditions, drainage issues, and maintenance requirements that affect both current operations and future planning. Most families approach plot selection systematically, considering factors like proximity to deceased relatives, accessibility for elderly visitors, religious or cultural preferences, and budget constraints. I help them navigate these decisions with sensitivity, understanding that choosing a burial plot forces people to confront mortality in concrete terms that can be emotionally overwhelming. The computer system generates regular reports on plot sales, revenue projections, and inventory management that I review monthly to identify trends and plan for future needs. These reports typically show predictable patterns. Premium locations sell quickly, while less desirable plots remain available longer. Seasonal variations affect sales timing, and family plot purchases often cluster in specific sections. But there was one pattern that defied explanation. I first noticed it while preparing the annual inventory report for the cemetery board. Plot 19 in every section remained unsold, despite many of these locations being prime real estate that should have attracted buyers years ago. Section A, Plot 19, sits beneath a beautiful oak tree. Section D, Plot 19 overlooks the memorial garden, and Section G, Plot 19, is positioned near the main path for easy access. These should have been among the first plots sold in each section. I checked the computer records for any notations about why these plots remained available. The database showed them as available, with no restrictions, special pricing, or maintenance issues that might explain their persistent vacancy. According to the system, Plot 19 in each section was ready for sale and had been marketed at appropriate prices for years. Curious about this anomaly, I pulled the physical files for each section to review historical documentation. Maybe previous clerks had noted soil problems, drainage issues, or other factors that made these plots less desirable but hadn't transferred that information to the computer system. What I found in those dusty file folders was far more disturbing than soil conditions. Tucked into the back of each section's file folder were handwritten notes on small pieces of paper, some yellowed with age, others more recent. The handwriting varied. Different people had written these notes over the decades, but the content was remarkably consistent. The oldest note I found was dated 1952 and written in careful cursive. Plot 19, Section A. Don't disturb. Soil won't hold. It keeps coming back up. R. Thompson, groundskeeper. A note from 1967 in different handwriting read, Section C, Plot 19. Same problem as the others. Whatever we bury here resurfaces within days. Soil seems normal, but won't hold anything down. M. Foster, head groundskeeper. From 1979, Plot 19, Section F. Third attempt to bury test items. Always pushed back to surface overnight. Recommend permanent restriction. J. Williams, groundskeeper. Every section file contained similar notes spanning decades, all referring to Plot 19, all mentioning the same problem. Anything buried there would eventually return to the surface. The handwriting changed as different groundskeepers documented the issue over the years, but they all ended with the same ominous phrase, "It keeps coming back up." I counted 23 separate notes from different employees between 1952 and 2018, the most recent entry. The consistency was unsettling. Multiple people over 7 decades had encountered the same unexplained phenomenon and had felt compelled to document it for their successors. I decided to research the cemetery's early development to understand what might have caused soil problems in Plot 19 of every section. The original surveyor's reports, from 1937, were stored in the basement archives, and I spent an afternoon reviewing maps, soil tests, and development plans from the cemetery's construction. The surveyor's report contained a detail that made my blood run cold. Before Green Hill Cemetery was developed, the land had been the site of a tuberculosis sanatorium that operated from 1893 through 1928. The sanatorium had been demolished in 1935, but the report noted that several unmarked graves from the sanatorium's early years remained on the property. According to the surveyor's notes, these unmarked graves were located approximately where Plot 19 would fall in each planned section. The cemetery developers had decided to work around these existing graves rather than disturb them, but the exact locations had been lost when the sanatorium records were destroyed in a fire. I cross-referenced this information with tuberculosis mortality records from the County Historical Society. Between 1893 and 1928, over 400 patients had died at the sanatorium. Many were buried on the grounds in unmarked graves, particularly during the early years, when families couldn't afford to transport bodies home or were afraid of contagion. The pattern was becoming clear. Plot 19 in each section likely contained unmarked graves from the tuberculosis sanatorium. The soil problems that generations of groundskeepers had documented weren't geological issues. They were the result of existing burials that prevented new interments. But that explanation didn't account for the specific language in the groundskeepers' notes. They hadn't written about hitting coffins or encountering existing graves. They consistently described items being pushed back to surface and soil that won't hold, despite appearing normal. I decided to speak with Frank Morrison, the current head groundskeeper who'd been working at Green Hill for 15 years. When I showed him the collection of notes about Plot 19, his expression grew troubled. "I was wondering when someone would ask about those," he said quietly. "I've seen it myself, you know. The soil in Plot 19 of every section behaves differently from anywhere else in the cemetery." Frank described attempts to bury maintenance items, plant trees, and even install decorative stones in various Plot 19 locations. "Everything comes back up," he explained. "Not immediately, but within a few days or weeks. Doesn't matter how deep we dig or how much soil we pile on top, the earth just rejects whatever we try to put there." He pulled out a more recent notebook and showed me his own documentation of the phenomenon. In 2020, he had attempted to plant a memorial rosebush in Section H, Plot 19. Despite digging a proper hole and following standard planting procedures, the bush had gradually worked its way to the surface over several weeks, roots and all, as if the soil were slowly pushing it upward. "It's not natural," Frank said. "Normal soil settlement causes things to sink deeper over time, not rise to the surface. But in Plot 19, everything moves upward, always." I asked if he had any theories about what might cause this unusual behavior. Frank was quiet for a long moment before answering. "My grandfather worked here in the 1950s, he said finally. "He was the one who told me to stay away from Plot 19 when I first started. Said the ground there belonged to people who died angry, people who didn't want to stay buried." Frank's grandfather had been Robert Thompson, the groundskeeper who'd written the first note I'd found in the files. The warning about Plot 19 had been passed down through 3 generations of the same family. That evening, I stayed late to review more historical documents, hoping to understand what had made the tuberculosis patients buried in Plot 19 different from other sanatorium deaths. What I discovered in the county health department records was deeply disturbing. Plot 19 in each section corresponded to the locations where the sanatorium had buried patients who died under suspicious circumstances. These were people who had been committed to the facility against their will, patients who had tried repeatedly to escape, individuals who had died during experimental treatments that the sanatorium had conducted without consent or family knowledge. The records showed a pattern of coercive treatment, illegal confinement, and medical experimentation that had continued for decades before being exposed in a 1927 scandal that led to the sanatorium's closure. Many of the people buried in unmarked graves had died fighting to leave, protesting their treatment, or trying to escape the facility. If Frank's grandfather was right, Plot 19 contained the remains of people who had died angry and unwilling to accept their fate. People who had been forced into the ground against their will and continued to resist burial even decades after death. The following week, I made a decision that I now regret. I needed to understand what was really happening in Plot 19, so I arranged to observe one of Frank's attempts to bury a test item. We chose Section E, Plot 19, which appeared to have normal soil composition and drainage. Frank dug a hole 2 feet deep and placed a metal marker post inside, then covered it with soil and tamped it down firmly. We marked the location and agreed to check it daily to document any changes. 3 days later, the metal post had moved 6 inches closer to the surface. A week later, it was completely exposed, standing upright in the exact center of Plot 19, as if it had been carefully placed there rather than buried. But the most unsettling discovery came 2 weeks after our experiment. When I arrived at work that morning, I found a new handwritten note tucked under my office door. The paper was aged, the ink was faded blue, and the handwriting was shaky but legible. Stop digging in our ground. We don't want your markers. We don't want your flowers. We don't want to be forgotten, but we don't want to be disturbed. Leave Plot 19 alone. The Angry Dead. I compared the handwriting to samples in the historical files. It matched the style and ink that might have been used in the 1920s, but the paper was warm to the touch and smelled faintly of disinfectant, as if it had just come from a medical facility. Frank and I never attempted another experiment in Plot 19. We added our own notes to the files, continuing the tradition of warnings that had been passed down for 70 years. Plot 19 in every section remains unsold, and we make sure it stays that way. I still maintain the cemetery records, still help families choose burial plots, still file the paperwork that keeps Greenhill operating smoothly. But I never recommend Plot 19 to anyone, and I never mention the handwritten notes that continue to appear under my office door whenever we get too curious about the angry dead who refuse to stay buried. Some ground, I've learned, belongs to the people already resting there, and some of those people aren't resting at all. Love doesn't end with death, but sometimes it forgets the rules of the living. My name is Rosa Martinez, and I've been the evening receptionist at Whitmore Funeral Home for 6 years. It's quiet work that suits my temperament, greeting visitors during evening viewings, maintaining the guest books, ensuring the viewing rooms stay comfortable and respectful, and locking up the building when the last families depart. Most people find funeral homes unsettling, but I've grown comfortable with the gentle dignity of these final farewells and the peaceful atmosphere that settles over the building after business hours. Whitmore Funeral Home has been serving our community since 1949, housed in a converted Victorian mansion that retains its original character while accommodating the needs of a modern funeral service. The building features 3 viewing rooms, a chapel for services, administrative offices, and preparation areas that families never see. My reception desk sits in the main foyer, positioned to welcome visitors and provide assistance during evening viewing hours when most families prefer to pay their respects. Evening viewings typically run from 5 p.m. to 8 p.m., with families gathering to remember their loved ones in an atmosphere of quiet conversation and shared grief. My role involves greeting visitors, maintaining sign-in books, answering questions about service times or directions, and ensuring that each viewing room maintains appropriate lighting, temperature, and flower arrangements. I also coordinate with the funeral directors to handle any special requests or concerns that arise during these private family times. The work requires sensitivity to different cultural traditions, religious practices, and family dynamics that affect how people approach death and mourning. Some families prefer large gatherings with extended conversations, while others come individually for private moments of reflection. I've learned to read the emotional temperature of each situation and provide appropriate support without intruding on personal grief. Most evenings follow predictable patterns. Families arrive between 5 and 6 p.m., spend an hour or two visiting with the deceased, and talking among themselves, then gradually depart as younger children grow tired or elderly relatives need to return home. By 8:30 p.m., I'm usually alone in the building, completing my closing duties and ensuring everything is prepared for the next day's activities. The funeral home maintains detailed guest books for each service, both as memorial keepsakes for families and as records of who attended viewings. These books serve important purposes. Families often treasure them as evidence of how many people cared about their loved one, and funeral directors use them to track attendance and coordinate thank you cards or acknowledgments. I'm responsible for placing fresh guest books in each viewing room, monitoring them throughout the evening, and securing them afterward. After evening viewings conclude, I walk through each room to ensure windows are locked, lights are properly adjusted for overnight security, and flower arrangements are positioned safely. The building has an alarm system, but my closing routine includes visual checks that everything is secure and appropriate. Finally, I lock the front entrance and activate the security system before leaving through the staff exit. The building becomes remarkably quiet after families depart. During viewing hours, there's always the soft murmur of conversation, occasional tears, and the gentle sounds of people moving through the rooms. But once I'm alone, the funeral home settles into a peaceful silence that I find comforting rather than eerie. It's a respectful quiet that seems appropriate for a place dedicated to honoring the deceased. Mr. Chen's viewing was scheduled for 3 consecutive evenings in early October, following his death from complications related to diabetes. He had been 87 years old, a retired businessman who'd emigrated from Taiwan in the 1960s and built a successful restaurant that became a neighborhood institution. His family was large and close-knit, with children, grandchildren, and extended relatives who came to pay their respects during the scheduled viewing hours. The first evening brought about 40 visitors, a steady stream of family members and longtime customers who remembered Mr. Chen's kindness and generosity. I placed a fresh guest book on the table near the entrance to his viewing room and watched as people signed their names, often adding brief messages about how Mr. Chen had touched their lives. The atmosphere was warm despite the sadness, filled with stories and shared memories that celebrated a life well lived. When I conducted my closing routine that evening, I checked the guest book and found it contained 37 signatures from the people who had attended. The handwriting varied from careful cursive to hurried printing, with messages in both English and Chinese characters. I secured the book in the viewing room and completed my normal shutdown procedures before leaving at 9:15 p.m. The next morning, the day receptionist mentioned that the Chen family had called to express gratitude for the beautiful presentation and the care we'd shown during their time of grief. Everything had proceeded smoothly, and the family was looking forward to the second evening of viewing before the funeral service. But when I arrived for my shift that afternoon and checked the guest book in Mr. Chen's viewing room, I found something that made me pause. There was an additional signature at the bottom of the previous evening's entries. The name Margaret Chen was written in careful cursive that looked slightly faded, as if the ink had been applied with an older pen. The handwriting was elegant but had a slight tremor that suggested it had been written by someone elderly or perhaps emotional. I reviewed my mental inventory of the previous evening's visitors, trying to remember if I had missed someone during my head count. It was possible that a family member had returned briefly after I thought everyone had left, perhaps to sign the book before departing. Sometimes elderly relatives move slowly, and I might not have noticed someone taking extra time to add their signature. The second evening of viewing brought another large gathering, with some repeat visitors and many new faces as word spread through the community about Mr. Chen's passing. I paid closer attention to the guest book throughout the evening, watching as people signed and noting the approximate number of signatures accumulating. By the end of the viewing period, I counted 42 signatures from the evening's visitors. During my closing routine, I checked the guest book again and found 43 signatures. Once again, Margaret Chen appeared at the bottom in the same careful cursive handwriting. This time, I was certain that no one had signed the book after the last family members departed, because I had been watching the viewing room continuously while conducting my final walkthrough. I made a note to ask the funeral director about Margaret Chen the next morning, Perhaps she was an elderly relative who preferred to visit privately, or someone who had special access to the building for personal reasons. Family dynamics during grief can be complicated, and I wanted to ensure I wasn't missing something important about the Chen family's wishes. Mr. Morrison, the funeral director handling the Chen service, reviewed his family information when I asked about Margaret. According to his records, Mr. Chen's immediate family consisted of 3 children, 8 grandchildren, and several cousins and nieces. There was no Margaret Chen listed among the relatives, and the family hadn't mentioned anyone by that name who might be expected to attend the viewing. Margaret could be a family friend or someone from the restaurant, Mr. Morrison suggested. Sometimes, people sign guest books using names that the immediate family doesn't immediately recognize, especially if they knew the deceased through business relationships or community activities. I accepted this explanation but decided to watch the guest book more carefully during the third and final evening of viewing. If Margaret Chen appeared again, I wanted to understand how she was gaining access to sign the book without being observed. The third evening brought the largest gathering yet, with over 50 people coming to pay their final respects before the funeral service. I monitored the guest book throughout the evening, occasionally checking the running total of signatures and observing who was approaching the table. Every signature I witnessed being added corresponded to a person I could see in the viewing room. As the evening wound down and families began departing, I positioned myself where I could observe both the guest book and the entrance to the viewing room. The last visitors left at 8:20 p.m., and I immediately checked the guest book to count the evening's signatures. There were 53 names from people who had attended. I then began my closing routine, starting with the other viewing rooms before returning to Mr. Chen's room. When I checked the guest book again 15 minutes later, it contained 54 signatures. Margaret Chen had been added at the bottom, written in the same elegant cursive that was now noticeably shakier than in previous entries. This time I was absolutely certain that no one had entered the viewing room after the last family members left. I had been watching continuously, and the building's alarm system would have detected any exterior doors opening. Margaret Chen was somehow signing the guest book without being physically present in the room. I decided to ask the Chen family directly about Margaret. When Mr. Chen's oldest son arrived the next morning for the funeral service, I mentioned that someone named Margaret Chen had been signing the guest book each evening and asked if they knew who she might be. His reaction was immediate and unsettling. His face went pale, and he exchanged glances with his sister before answering. "Margaret was my father's wife," he said quietly. "She died 20 years ago from cancer. They were married for 43 years before she passed." "But her name in the guest book is Margaret Chen," I said. "Wouldn't she have signed her married name?" His sister spoke up. "Mother never took Dad's name legally. She always signed everything with her maiden name, Margaret Sullivan. Even after they were married, she preferred to use Sullivan for all her signatures and official documents. It was important to her to maintain her Irish heritage." The implications of what they were telling me settled over me like cold water. Someone or something had been signing the guest book as Margaret Chen, using a name that the deceased wife would never have used while she was alive. The signatures appeared to be written by someone who didn't understand that Margaret had always used her maiden name. "We need to see the guest book," Mr. Chen's son said with growing urgency. I brought the book to the family, and they examined the 3 Margaret Chen signatures with increasing distress. The handwriting was familiar to them. They recognized their mother's distinctive cursive style, but the name was wrong in a way that Margaret herself would never have made. "This is how Mother used to write," the daughter whispered. "But she would never have signed Margaret Chen. She was always proud to be Margaret Sullivan, even after marriage. She used to say that becoming a wife didn't mean losing her identity." We examined the signatures more closely. The handwriting deteriorated slightly with each entry, becoming more tremulous and uncertain. The first signature was confident and clear. The second showed slight wavering, and the third appeared to have been written with considerable effort, as if by someone whose hand was becoming unsteady. That afternoon, during the funeral service, I found myself watching the Chen family with new understanding of their grief. Mr. Chen had not only lost his wife 20 years ago, but now seemed to be receiving visits from her spirit during his own final farewell. The wrong name suggested that Margaret was somehow confused about her identity, or perhaps that death had changed her understanding of who she had been in life. After the service concluded and the Chen family departed for the burial, I was left alone in the funeral home with the guest book that contained impossible signatures. I placed it in our archive file with other memorial books, but I couldn't stop thinking about Margaret's increasingly shaky handwriting and the name she would never have chosen for herself. That evening, as I conducted my final walkthrough of the now empty viewing room where Mr. Chen had lain in state, I found a single white rose on the table beside where the guest book had been placed. There were no white roses among the funeral arrangements. The family had chosen red roses and chrysanthemums for their displays. I picked up the rose and found it was fresh, with droplets of moisture still clinging to the petals. Attached to the stem was a small card with elegant, cursive handwriting that I now recognized. "Thank you for taking care of him, Margaret Sullivan." This time, she had signed her true name. I kept that rose in a vase on my reception desk for 2 weeks, until it finally withered, and I had to throw it away. But sometimes, during quiet evening shifts when I'm alone in the funeral home, I catch the faint scent of roses in the air and remember that love doesn't end with death. It just sometimes gets confused about the details of how things used to be. Margaret found her way back to say goodbye to her husband, even if she temporarily forgot who she had been while she was alive. And in the end, she remembered her true name and the identity she had fought to preserve throughout her marriage and beyond. Death, I've learned, affects some people differently than others. My name is Alan Hayes, and I've been working as an embalmer's assistant at Riverside Memorial for 5 years. It's technical work that requires precision, respect for the deceased, and an understanding that families depend on us to present their loved ones with dignity during their final farewell. Most people don't think about what happens between death and burial, but that time is crucial for both the practical aspects of preservation and the emotional needs of grieving families who want to remember their loved one looking peaceful and natural. Riverside Memorial serves the entire county, handling everything from expected deaths in hospitals and nursing homes to sudden passings that require more complex preparation. Our facility includes a modern embalming room, refrigeration units, a preparation area for cosmetic work, and viewing rooms where families can spend private time with the deceased before funeral services. The work follows state regulations and professional standards that ensure both public health safety and respectful treatment of human remains. I work primarily with Mr. Davidson, the head embalmer, who's been practicing for 23 years. He's taught me the scientific aspects of preservation arterial injection, cavity treatment, tissue restoration, as well as the artistic elements that help the deceased appear natural and at peace. Every body requires different approaches based on age, cause of death, time elapsed since death, and family preferences for viewing arrangements. The embalming process typically takes 2 to 4 hours, depending on complexity, followed by cosmetic preparation that can add another hour or 2. Bodies are then placed in refrigeration until viewing or burial arrangements are finalized. Most funeral homes maintain the deceased for 3 to 7 days between death and service, though sometimes insurance complications or family travel requirements extend that period. My responsibilities include preparing the embalming room, assisting with arterial and cavity procedures, maintaining equipment, and helping with cosmetic restoration that ensures the deceased look natural for family viewing. I also handle scheduling, coordinate with funeral directors about timing, and maintain detailed records of all procedures performed. The work requires both technical skill and emotional sensitivity to the fact that every body represents someone's loved one. Most bodies respond predictably to preservation procedures. Embalming chemicals halt decomposition, firm up tissues, and restore a natural color that helps families remember their loved one as they were in life rather than as they appeared at death. The goal is always to create a peaceful, dignified appearance that provides comfort to grieving families and allows for meaningful final goodbyes. But some bodies respond to embalming in ways that seem to defy both science and experience. I first noticed the anomaly with Mrs. Eleanor Whitman, an 82-year-old woman who had died alone in her apartment after what appeared to be a peaceful heart attack. Her body wasn't discovered for 3 days, which typically presents challenges for restoration skin discoloration, tissue breakdown, and other post-mortem changes that require extra attention during preparation. Mr. Davidson and I began the standard embalming procedure, expecting to encounter the usual complications associated with delayed discovery. But Mrs. Whitman's tissues responded unusually well to the preservation process. Her skin retained perfect elasticity, her muscle tone appeared normal, and her facial features maintained the natural fullness of someone who had just fallen asleep. "This is remarkable," Mr. Davidson commented during the procedure. "She looks like she passed away an hour ago, not 3 days. Sometimes the embalming process works better than expected, but this is exceptional preservation." We completed the standard procedures and moved Mrs. Whitman to refrigeration to await her family's arrangements. Due to complications with insurance and family members traveling from out of state, her viewing was scheduled for 2 weeks after death, longer than typical, but not unusual for complex family situations. When we prepared Mrs. Whitman for viewing, I was struck by how lifelike she appeared. The preservation was so effective that she looked like she was simply sleeping deeply, with natural color in her cheeks, and none of the slight artificial appearance that even the best embalming usually produces. Her family was amazed by how peaceful and alive she looked, commenting repeatedly on how the preparation had captured her exactly as they remembered her. 3 weeks after Mrs. Whitman's death, her family decided to have her body transported to another state for burial in a family plot. When we prepared her for transport, I expected to see some deterioration despite our preservation work. Instead, she looked exactly as she had during the viewing: perfect skin tone, natural muscle firmness, and an appearance so lifelike that I found myself checking for breathing several times. Mr. Davidson was equally surprised by the preservation quality. "In 23 years, I've never seen embalming maintain this level of natural appearance for 3 weeks," he told me. "She looks better now than most bodies look after 3 days." The second case was Mr. Robert Kim, a 78-year-old man who had died alone in his car after suffering what appeared to be a stroke while running errands. He was discovered the following morning and brought to our facility for preparation. Like Mrs. Whitman, Mr. Kim had died without family present, alone and apparently peaceful. The embalming process proceeded normally, but again I noticed exceptional tissue response to the preservation chemicals. Mr. Kim's skin remained supple and naturally colored. His facial features maintained their living fullness, and his overall appearance was remarkably lifelike. Mr. Davidson attributed it to good health before death and optimal embalming conditions. Mr. Kim's viewing was delayed for 10 days due to family travel, and like Mrs. Whitman, he showed no signs of deterioration when we prepared him for presentation. His children were moved to tears by how natural and peaceful he appeared, saying he looked exactly as he had when they'd spoken to him by phone the day before his death. I began paying closer attention to preservation outcomes, particularly noting which bodies maintained exceptional lifelike appearance and which followed more typical patterns. A clear pattern emerged over the following months. Bodies of people who had died alone consistently showed superior preservation, maintaining perfect skin elasticity, natural coloring, and lifelike muscle tone for weeks longer than medically expected. Bodies of people who died, surrounded by family, in hospitals with medical staff present, or in situations where others were nearby, showed normal preservation patterns. The embalming was effective and families were satisfied with the appearance, but the results followed predictable timelines for tissue firmness and color retention. But people who died alone in their homes, cars, or other solitary circumstances seemed to resist the normal progression of death in ways that challenged everything I understood about human biology and preservation science. Mrs. Dorothy Santos was the third case that convinced me something unusual was happening. She had died alone in her garden at age 74, apparently while tending her roses on a sunny afternoon. Her body wasn't discovered until the next evening, when neighbors became concerned about her absence. During embalming, Mrs. Santos showed the same exceptional tissue response I'd observed with Mrs. Whitman and Mr. Kim. But this time, I paid closer attention to details that might explain the phenomenon. Her skin remained warm to the touch longer than normal. Her tissues seemed to accept embalming fluid more readily than typical. And her facial expression maintained a peaceful serenity that looked genuinely restful rather than artificially imposed. Mrs. Santos remained in our care for 18 days before her memorial service. Throughout that period, I checked on her condition daily, documenting observations that I hoped might help Mr. Davidson understand what was causing these exceptional preservation outcomes. Every day, she looked exactly the same, peaceful, natural, and so lifelike that I sometimes felt compelled to check for vital signs. On the 16th day, something happened that changed my understanding of what we were dealing with. I was working alone in the preparation room, updating records and organizing supplies for the next day's procedures. The building was quiet, with only the hum of refrigeration units and the soft sounds of evening traffic outside. I decided to check on Mrs. Santos one final time before leaving, ensuring she was properly positioned for the viewing scheduled for the following day. When I opened the refrigeration unit, Mrs. Santos looked exactly as she had for over 2 weeks, peaceful, natural, and disturbingly lifelike. But as I stood there, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Her chest was moving. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but unmistakable. The slow, steady rise and fall of deep, peaceful breathing. I watched for several minutes, certain I was imagining things, but the movement continued. Mrs. Santos, who had been dead for 16 days and thoroughly embalmed, was breathing. I checked for a pulse at her wrist and neck, finding nothing. Her skin was cool to the touch, consistent with refrigeration. There was no heartbeat detectable by stethoscope, no response to stimuli, no brain activity that could be measured. By every medical standard, Mrs. Santos was dead and had been dead for over 2 weeks. But she was breathing. I called Mr. Davidson at home, trying to describe what I was observing without sounding hysterical. He arrived within 30 minutes and confirmed my observations. Mrs. Santos showed no vital signs, except for the slow, rhythmic breathing that continued throughout his examination. "This is impossible," he said quietly, but he couldn't deny what we were both witnessing. "She's been embalmed. Her circulatory system has been replaced with preservation chemicals. There's no biological mechanism that could sustain breathing." We observed Mrs. Santos for another hour, documenting the breathing pattern and checking repeatedly for any other signs of life. The breathing never varied, always slow, peaceful, and regular, like someone in deep sleep. But every other indicator confirmed that she was deceased and had been for over 2 weeks. Mr. Davidson decided we needed to proceed with the scheduled viewing, but we agreed to monitor Mrs. Santos closely during the family gathering. If the breathing continued or intensified, we would need to consider involving medical authorities, though we had no idea how to explain what we were observing. During the viewing, Mrs. Santos appeared exactly as her family expected, peaceful, dignified, and remarkably lifelike. Family members commented repeatedly on how natural she looked, how it seemed like she was just sleeping deeply, and how the preparation had captured her exactly as they remembered her. None of them noticed the breathing. I positioned myself where I could observe Mrs. Santos throughout the viewing, watching for any changes in the breathing pattern or signs that family members were becoming aware of the movement. The breathing continued steadily, but it was subtle enough that grieving family members, focused on their emotions and memories, didn't detect it. After the viewing concluded and the family departed, Mr. Davidson and I discussed what we should do. The breathing had continued for over 24 hours, showing no signs of stopping or changing. Mrs. Santos looked more alive than many living people I'd encountered, despite being medically and legally dead for over 2 weeks. "I think, Mr. Davidson said finally, that some people don't want to let go. They died alone, without the chance to say goodbye, and some part of them is refusing to accept that death is final." It was the closest thing to an explanation we could formulate. People who died alone, without the comfort of family presence or the closure of final farewells, seemed to maintain some essential spark that kept their bodies functioning in ways that defied medical understanding. Mrs. Santos was buried the following day, still breathing peacefully in her casket. I've never told her family about what we observed, and I've never found any medical literature that explains how embalmed bodies can maintain respiratory function weeks after death. But I've continued to notice the pattern. People who die alone consistently show exceptional preservation, maintain lifelike appearance far longer than expected, and sometimes exhibit subtle signs of biological activity that shouldn't be possible. They look peaceful and natural because, in some fundamental way, they're not quite ready to be dead. I still work at Riverside Memorial, still assist with embalming procedures, still help families say goodbye to their loved ones. But I've developed a deep respect for the power of solitude in death and the possibility that dying alone doesn't always mean departing alone. Some people, it seems, take longer to let go than others, and sometimes the preservation we provide gives them the time they need to find their own peace. Some bells ring for the living, but others toll for souls that cannot rest. My name is Father Patrick Mackenzie, and I've been the chaplain at St. Catherine Cemetery for 12 years. It's pastoral work that combines my calling to minister to grieving families with the practical responsibilities of conducting graveside services, maintaining the chapel, and providing spiritual comfort during the most difficult moments of human experience. The cemetery has served our community since 1894, with a small stone chapel that hosts funeral services for families of all denominations who seek a sacred space for their final farewells. St. Catherine spans 28 acres of peaceful rolling hills, with burial sections dating back over a century and newer areas that accommodate contemporary needs. The chapel sits at the heart of the cemetery, built in the same local fieldstone as the original boundary walls, with Gothic windows that cast colored light across wooden pews and a simple altar that serves families regardless of their specific religious traditions. My role involves conducting services, coordinating with funeral directors, maintaining cemetery records, and providing pastoral care to anyone who needs spiritual support during their time of grief. The chapel bell tower contains a bronze bell cast in 1896, originally used to call the community to worship and to mark significant occasions. The bell served that purpose until 1978, when the rope mechanism was removed after concerns about structural integrity and insurance liability. Since then, the bell has remained silent, a historical artifact that adds character to the chapel but no longer functions for ceremonial purposes. My daily routine varies depending on scheduled services, but typically includes morning prayers in the chapel, preparation for any funerals or memorial services, coordination with families and funeral directors about timing and special requests, and general maintenance of the chapel and surrounding grounds. I live in a small rectory adjacent to the cemetery, which allows me to be available for emergency calls and to maintain the peaceful atmosphere that families need during their most vulnerable moments. Graveside services require sensitivity to different cultural traditions, religious practices, and family dynamics that affect how people approach death and mourning. Some families prefer traditional liturgical services with familiar prayers and hymns, while others want more personalized ceremonies that reflect the unique life and personality of the deceased. I've learned to adapt my approach to serve each family's needs while maintaining the dignity and comfort that sacred ritual can provide during grief. The work brings me into contact with death, in all its forms-expected passings, after long illnesses, sudden accidents that shock communities, the peaceful deaths of elderly people who lived full lives, and the heartbreaking loss of young people whose potential was cut short. Each service presents different challenges and different opportunities to provide meaningful comfort to those left behind. Most families find solace in the familiar rhythms of funeral liturgy, the beauty of the chapel setting, and the sense that their loved one is being laid to rest in consecrated ground with appropriate ceremony. The graveside service typically concludes with final prayers, the commitment of the body to the earth, and a moment of silence that allows families to begin processing their loss in a supportive environment. But over the past year, I've begun to notice something unusual that occurs after certain burial services. The first time I heard the bell ring, I assumed it was a mechanical malfunction or perhaps wind affecting the bell housing in ways I didn't understand. The service had been for Margaret O'Sullivan, an elderly woman who died after a long battle with cancer, leaving behind unfinished quilts and a dozen foster children she'd been unable to see one final time. As her family dispersed after the graveside service, I heard 7 clear, distinct bell tolls coming from the chapel tower. I investigated immediately, checking the bell housing and examining the tower for any signs of mechanical problems or external interference. The bell rope had been removed 37 years earlier, and there was no mechanism that could cause the bell to ring spontaneously. Yet I had clearly heard 7 deliberate tolls, spaced evenly like a ceremonial announcement. I mentioned the incident to Tom Morrison, the cemetery groundskeeper who'd been working at St. Catherine's for 25 years. He listened to my description with a troubled expression. "My father used to tell me about that bell," Tom said quietly. "He worked here in the 1950s and 60s, before the rope was removed. Said the bell would sometimes ring on its own after funerals, especially for people who died with unfinished business or unresolved problems." Tom's father had documented several instances of spontaneous bell ringing, always 7 tolls, always following burial services for people whose deaths had left important matters incomplete. The phenomenon had been noted in cemetery records but never explained, and it had stopped occurring after the rope was removed in 1978. "But that's impossible now," Tom continued. "There's no mechanism for the bell to ring. Even if there was some kind of spiritual activity, it would need something physical to make the bell move." I began paying closer attention after subsequent funeral services, listening for any repetition of the mysterious bell tolls. For several months, I heard nothing unusual, and I started to believe the incident with Mrs. Prame. O'Sullivan had been an acoustic anomaly or some kind of auditory hallucination brought on by stress or emotional investment in particularly moving services. Then I conducted the funeral for Robert Chen, a middle-aged businessman who died suddenly of a heart attack while working late at his office. His family spoke during the service about projects he'd left unfinished, promises he'd made to his children that would never be fulfilled, and plans for retirement that had been postponed too many times. As the graveside service concluded and the family began walking back to their cars, I heard the bell ring 7 times. This time I was listening specifically for the sound, and there was no mistaking what I heard. 7 clear, measured tolls coming from the chapel bell tower, despite the absence of any mechanism that could produce them. The sound carried across the cemetery with the same resonance and clarity as it would have when the bell was fully functional. I began researching the history of the chapel bell and its relationship to cemetery services. The archives contained references to the toll for the restless in records from the early 1900s, indicating that spontaneous bell ringing had been documented for decades before the rope was removed. Cemetery workers had noted that the bell rang only after services for people whose deaths left significant, unfinished business, unfulfilled promises, unresolved conflicts, or important work left incomplete. The pattern became consistent over the following months. Not every funeral triggered the bell-only services for people whose deaths had interrupted important aspects of their lives. A young mother who died in a car accident before seeing her daughter graduate. An elderly man who passed away the day before his 50th wedding anniversary. A teacher who died during summer break, leaving lesson plans prepared for students she would never teach. Always 7 tolls. Always clear and unmistakable. Always impossible according to the physical reality of a bell tower with no functioning mechanism. I started keeping detailed records of which funerals triggered the bell ringing, noting patterns that might help me understand what was happening. The common factor was always unfinished business deaths that occurred at moments when the deceased had significant incomplete commitments, unfulfilled promises, or important relationships left unresolved. The ringing seemed to serve as an acknowledgement of the spiritual restlessness that surrounded these particular deaths. 7 tolls marking the passage of souls who couldn't rest peacefully because their earthly responsibilities remained unfulfilled. It was both beautiful and deeply unsettling, a sign that death doesn't always bring the peace that funeral liturgy promises. Yesterday's service changed everything I thought I understood about the chapel bell. Martha Wilson had been 93 years old when she died peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by family and apparently ready for her final rest. She had been a devoted wife, mother, and grandmother who'd lived to see her great-grandchildren and had spent her final years contentedly reviewing a life well lived. By all accounts, Martha's death represented the kind of peaceful conclusion that religious tradition celebrates a soul prepared for eternity, leaving behind a legacy of love and completed responsibilities. The funeral service was beautiful, with 5 generations of family gathering to celebrate Martha's long and meaningful life. Her great-granddaughter sang a hymn that Martha had requested. Her children shared memories of her wisdom and kindness, and the entire ceremony felt like a joyful send-off for someone who had finished her earthly journey with grace and completion. As the graveside service concluded, and I offered the final blessing over Martha's casket, I expected silence from the chapel bell tower. Martha Wilson appeared to represent everything opposite to the pattern I'd observed at a death that brought closure rather than leaving unfinished business, a life that had reached natural completion rather than being cut short with important work undone. But as the family dispersed and I gathered my liturgical materials, I heard the bell begin to toll. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then, for the first time in all my observations, an 8th toll. The sound of that 8th bell reverberated across the cemetery with an intensity that seemed to shake the ground beneath my feet. It was deeper, more resonant, and somehow more final than the 7 tolls I'd grown accustomed to hearing. The 8th toll carried a weight and significance that felt fundamentally different from the pattern I'd documented. I stood frozen beside Martha's grave, trying to understand what the 8th toll might mean. 7 tolls had always marked souls with unfinished earthly business, but Martha Wilson had completed her life's work. What could the 8th toll represent? That evening, I received a phone call that provided a devastating answer. Martha Wilson's great-granddaughter, the young woman who had sung so beautifully at the funeral service, had been killed in a car accident while driving home from the cemetery. Sarah Wilson, 22 years old, had died just hours after singing her great-grandmother's favorite hymn, her own life cut short with dreams unfulfilled and promises she would never have the chance to keep. The 8th toll hadn't been for Martha Wilson's unfinished business. It had been a harbinger, an announcement that Martha's peaceful death would be followed by another death one that would indeed leave significant unfinished business. The bell had somehow known that Sarah Wilson would not survive the day, and it had tolled once for Martha's completed life, and once more for the life that would be tragically interrupted. I've continued conducting services at St. Catherine's, and the bell continues to ring 7 tolls for souls who die with unfinished business. But I've never again heard an 8th toll, and I pray I never will. The possibility that the chapel bell can somehow announce not just the restless dead, but the deaths yet to come, is more unsettling than any supernatural phenomenon I could have imagined. The bell in the tower remains silent most days, a bronze sentinel that marks only the passages of souls who cannot rest. But sometimes, late at night when I'm praying in the chapel, I find myself listening for that 8th toll and wondering whose life it might foretell. Some bells ring for the dead, but others ring for the dying, and some truths are too terrible to wish upon any grieving family.